Here is a rare insight most viewers never hear. The hopeful ending of The Truman Show was not the original vision. Early drafts were colder, more clinical, and far less forgiving. The version we celebrate today nearly ended in psychological ruin. Director Peter Weir and writer Andrew Niccol wrestled over tone, while Jim Carrey fought to keep Truman human. What survived was optimism. What was cut was far darker. Number 20. The original script was set in a gritty dystopia before Seahaven's pastel perfection. Niccol imagined a grim urban nightmare. Truman lived in a claustrophobic city that felt oppressive rather than artificial. The tone leaned toward psychological horror. Instead of sunny satire, the world was cold, metallic, and corporate. The bright suburb was later chosen to heighten irony. In the early draft, there was no comfort to contrast the manipulation. It was bleak from the start. This shift dramatically softened the story. The dystopian version implied Truman was trapped in a decaying society that mirrored real-world media exploitation. By moving to a polished dome city, the film disguised cruelty behind beauty. That choice changed everything. Number 19. Christof was originally more monstrous. The character later played by Ed Harris was first written as colder and less philosophical. Early Christof was not a misguided creator. He was a corporate scientist obsessed with control and profit. There was less spiritual dialogue, no godlike tenderness, only calculated dominance. This darker portrayal would have made the ending harsher. Instead of a paternal farewell, Christof's final plea might have sounded like a threat. The released version adds nuance and ambiguity. But originally, Christof represented corporate voyeurism at its most ruthless. His humanity was toned down to make Truman's escape feel like moral victory rather than rebellion against a monster. Number 18. Truman's breakdown was more severe. In early drafts, Truman did not simply grow suspicious. He spiraled, paranoia intensified into emotional collapse. Scenes described deeper psychological fragmentation. His discovery of the truth was closer to trauma than awakening. This darker approach risked making him unstable rather than heroic. Carrey pushed back against portraying Truman as broken beyond repair. The final version keeps his innocence intact, but the original concept leaned toward horror. The show was not just deception, it was psychological imprisonment, and the damage was permanent. Number 17. The audience was written as disturbingly addicted. The global viewers inside the film were initially less sympathetic. Early versions portrayed them as numb and voyeuristic. They consumed Truman's suffering without guilt. Ratings spiked during his emotional pain. The public was complicit. In the final film, viewers cry and root for him. That shift softens the indictment. Originally, Niccol intended sharper satire. Society was meant to appear addicted to spectacle. Truman's fear was entertainment. His breakdown was content. That version would have forced audiences to confront their own voyeurism more directly. Number 16. The ending was almost ambiguous and hopeless. The most disturbing change involves the ending. Early drafts did not emphasize triumphant freedom. Truman's escape was uncertain. The outside world was barely shown and morally questionable. Some interpretations suggest he would struggle to function, overwhelmed and disoriented. The final cut allows him to bow and step through the door with dignity, but originally, the door symbolized something more frightening, not freedom, oblivion, a leap into a world just as manipulative as the one he left. Number 15. The storm scene was almost fatal. In early conceptual discussions, the storm sequence was not simply a test of Truman's courage, it was nearly written as a lethal escalation. Christof's willingness to endanger Truman was more extreme. The storm could have gone too far, the implication was chilling. The show might have killed its own star for ratings. In the final version of The Truman Show, Truman survives through determination and moral clarity, but the darker interpretation suggests a scenario where corporate obsession overrides basic humanity. If Truman had drowned, the broadcast would not necessarily stop. The horror lies in the possibility that spectacle mattered more than life. Number 14. Seahaven was designed as a psychological cage. Seahaven looks comforting, white fences, blue skies, perfect lawns, But the early production notes emphasized something more disturbing. The town was meant to feel subtly suffocating. Every symmetry was intentional, every smile rehearsed. The artificial calm created psychological pressure. Truman's world was engineered to discourage curiosity. Fear of water, trauma manipulation, social reinforcement, these were behavioral control mechanisms. In earlier drafts, the manipulation was more clinical and deliberate. Truman was not just entertained, he was conditioned. The brightness hides the horror. That contrast is what makes the final film effective. But originally, the control system was described in colder and more mechanical terms. Number 13. Truman was almost a corporate experiment. Nichols' early concept leaned toward a scientific experiment rather than a sentimental media event. Truman was not merely adopted for entertainment. He was studied, monitored, measured. The show functioned like a long-term behavioral trial. Producers tracked reactions, emotional responses, consumer trends. This angle implied Truman's life was data, not narrative. By softening this idea, the final film made the premise accessible. But the darker framework suggests a world where corporations test human development for profit. The experiment never ends, it simply evolves. Number 12, the outside world was not meant to be hopeful. The theatrical ending suggests Truman enters a messy but authentic world. Earlier drafts were less optimistic. The outside society was portrayed as equally shallow, fame-hungry, media-saturated. Truman might have traded one cage for another. This version implies that escape does not equal freedom. Surveillance culture exists beyond the dome. Exploitation continues in different forms. The horror becomes systemic rather than isolated. That ambiguity was largely removed. The final cut offers catharsis, but the original concept warned that the real world might be just as artificial. Number 11. Warchostu Agency Sylvia's role was nearly reduced. Sylvia provides Truman with emotional clarity. She represents truth. In earlier drafts, her presence was smaller and less romantic. Without her influence, Truman's motivation becomes purely instinctual. Removing that emotional anchor would make the story colder. Truman escapes not because of love, but because of existential dread. That shift changes tone dramatically. By expanding Sylvia's importance, the final film introduces hope. But the original structure leaned toward isolation. Truman was alone against a machine, and the machine was enormous. Number 10, the door in the sky was meant to feel like self-erasure. The iconic staircase and exit door were always symbolic. But in earlier interpretations, the image carried a far darker implication. The climb was not simply liberation. It resembled a surrender of identity. Truman was walking toward the death of the only world he had ever known. In early script discussions, the door in the sky was framed as existential annihilation. Once he steps through, the Truman constructed by the show ceases to exist. There is no guarantee of survival in a psychological sense. The theatrical version frames it as hope. But the original tone suggested something colder. Freedom might require destroying yourself first. That ambiguity gave the image a quiet horror that almost remained intact. Number 9. Ratings were written to spike during trauma. In Nichols' darker drafts, the audience response was less sentimental. Truman's emotional pain drove record viewership. His breakdown became premium content. Teen corporate executives debated tension arcs the way studios debate action sequences. This detail made the show feel grotesque. Suffering equaled profit. Fear equaled engagement. The narrative did not merely criticize reality television, it predicted it. The final film hints at this idea, but softens the commercial cruelty. Early versions emphasized that trauma was monetized deliberately. The more Truman suffered, the stronger the brand became. That version feels disturbingly prophetic. Number 8. Truman was almost manipulated into fatherhood. One unused thread involved pushing Truman toward starting a family purely for ratings growth. Parenthood would deepen audience attachment. A child born inside the dome would lock Truman emotionally in place. The idea was chilling. A second generation raised inside fabrication. Producers considered how to stage it, how to escalate sentiment. The final film avoids this direction, but the concept reveals how far the fictional network might have gone. Truman was not just an actor. He was intellectual property, Expanding the franchise through forced fatherhood would have turned the show into permanent captivity. Number 7. Kristoff's final speech was nearly colder. In the finished film. Kristoff speaks gently from the sky. His voice carries regret and pride, but earlier drafts removed much of that tenderness. His argument was more clinical. Truman was safer inside. The outside world was chaos. The experiment must continue. This colder version reframed the ending. Instead of a wounded creator pleading with his creation, Kristoff would have sounded like a CEO defending a product line. No emotional warmth, nigh only justification. By softening the speech, director Peter Weir introduced ambiguity. The darker speech would have made Truman's defiance feel like a revolution rather than a personal awakening. Number 6. The film almost ended without the bow. That small bow before Truman exits is crucial. It restores dignity. It proves self-awareness. Early versions did not emphasize that gesture. The ending cut quickly after his decision. No theatrical goodbye, no reclaiming of performance. Without the bow, the scene becomes harsher. Truman simply vanishes from the constructed world. The moment lacks grace. The final edition transforms the exit into a final act of agency. He performs once more, but this time on his own terms. Removing that detail would have left the audience unsettled rather than uplifted. On number 5, the corporation was meant to continue immediately. In early structural outlines, Truman's escape did not shut down the machine. Executives were prepared for contingency plans. Replacement subjects were discussed. The network would rebrand and relaunch. The show was bigger than the man. That detail was largely implied rather than shown in the final cut. But in darker drafts, it was clearer. Truman was not unique to the corporation. He was a prototype. If he escaped, another infant could be acquired. The horror lies in the system's resilience. Freedom, for one, does not dismantle exploitation. It merely exposes it. Number 4, Truman's identity crisis was meant to linger. The released ending cuts to black quickly after his exit. We never see what happens next. Early versions considered showing Truman overwhelmed outside the dome. Cameras gone, noise everywhere, no script. The idea suggested liberation would be traumatic. Decades of conditioning cannot vanish instantly. His sense of self might fracture. The world could feel hostile rather than welcoming. By not showing this, the final film preserves optimism. But the darker concept implied that escape is only the beginning of another psychological battle. Number 3. The show was written as a religious allegory gone wrong. The Kristoff figure was always symbolic, but early drafts leaned harder into religious manipulation. Kristoff positioned himself as creator and moral authority. Truman's suffering was justified as necessary design. This angle sharpened the moral indictment. The dome became a false heaven, the producer a flawed god. Truman's escape resembled a rejection of divine control. In the final version, the allegory is subtle. Earlier drafts made it sharper and more confrontational. The spiritual manipulation was explicit. That version would have been far more provocative. Number 2, the final frame. Almost focused on the audience, not Truman. One early ending concept shifted attention away from Truman entirely. Instead of lingering on his liberation, the camera would cut to viewers asking what else was on television. Indifference, distraction, consumption continues. That choice would have reframed the film as accusation. The audience becomes the final subject. Society moves on without reflection. By ending on Truman's bow instead, the film offers closure, but the alternate ending would have left viewers exposed and implicated. Number 1. The optimistic ending was the most radical change. The darkest fact of all is this: the hopeful ending we celebrate was never guaranteed. Writer Andrew Niccol imagined a colder conclusion. It was through performance and direction that emotional uplift survived. The version released in 1998 allows Truman dignity. It gives him agency. It implies that truth matters. That shift transformed the film from satire into cultural prophecy. Without that adjustment, the story might have felt nihilistic. Instead, it became quietly defiant. Jim Carrey fought to keep Truman innocent. Jim Carrey insisted that Truman should not become unstable or cruel as he discovered the truth. He argued that the power of the story depended on innocence, If Truman became bitter, the satire would collapse into cynicism. Jim Carrey's input reshaped the emotional core. His portrayal preserved vulnerability and humor even in fear. That choice softened the darkness of earlier drafts and anchored the film's lasting impact. The version of The Truman Show we know feels hopeful, but beneath that optimism lies a script that was colder and more merciless. The dome almost became a nightmare without mercy. Truman almost stepped into oblivion instead of freedom. And that is what makes the final bow so powerful. It was not inevitable. It was earned.